Hello there, and thank you for joining me for another pondering in a psalm. And today's psalm is Psalm 80. Those of you that have watched a number of these devotionals will be familiar with the way that I'm always looking for the key that unlocks the psalm. It might be a verse or a phrase, or sometimes even just a word, that is at the heart of the psalm, and which often is a clue as to the psalm's structure and its meaning. It's fairly obvious when we come to Psalm 80, because it comes in the form of a refrain or a chorus that appears 3 times in verses 3, 7, and again in 19. And these 3 verses are a prayer, not all that dissimilar from the Aaronic blessing of number 7. The idea of God's face being turned away or hidden from someone is an image of the sense of the absence of God and his blessing. And so this psalm expresses the anguish of a community who feel that God is absent and who long for a conscious sense of his nearness. In fact, in verse 1, the idea behind the word which the ESV translates as give ear is that of God's power being aroused from sleep so as to be mobilized for the benefit of his people. Now, before we take an overview of the psalm, I want to draw your attention to 2 strong images in the psalms with which we are probably familiar from the Old Testament, but which are actually, and I find surprisingly, quite rare in the Psalms themselves. First of all, in verse 1, God is addressed as the shepherd of Israel. In 2 recent Psalms of Asaph, 77 and 79, we've seen an allusion to this idea of God shepherding his people. And we're familiar with that picture, of course, from Psalm 23. But apart from a mention at the end of Psalm 28, this is the only other time in the Psalms when God is directly addressed in this way. And then in verses 8 to 18, there's the image of the people of God as a vine, with God as the vine planter and dresser. This is the only occurrence of this image in any of the Psalms. The psalmist pictures Israel as a vine that God has brought out of Egypt and planted in the promised land. Under his tender care it has flourished. It spread to the mountains in the south, to the cedars of Lebanon in the north, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and all the way over to the river Euphrates in the east. Now, of course, both these pictures appear in the New Testament, with Jesus describing himself both as the good shepherd and as the vine. So let's take a quick look at Psalm 80. Based around the 3-fold refrain, I see 3 sections, although we're going to look at the 3rd section in 2 parts. And the psalm begins with an appeal to God in verses 1 to 2, ending in the plea of verse 3. I love the strong way in which Asaph appeals to Yahweh, the shepherd of his people, to help them in their distress. God is pictured sitting enthroned in the temple above the golden cherubim that covered the Ark of the Covenant. Notice also how 4 times in this psalm, Asaph addresses God as the God of hosts, Elohim Sabaoth, the God who has all the hosts of heaven at his disposal and under his authority. So Asaph certainly has no doubt that God is able to do whatever he asks him. Then in verses 4 to 7, we have a lament which ends again in the psalm's core appeal. It is as if the sheep are saying to the shepherd, how long will you go on giving us tears to eat and drink? The 3rd and largest section takes us from verse 18 to the repeated appeal again in verse 19 and draws on the image of the vine. And the key to this section lies in the question why that comes in verse 12. You see, there seems to be genuine puzzlement expressed here as Asaph reflects on all God's labor of love to bring this vine out of Egypt, to plant it in the promised land, clearing the ground for it and tending it lovingly and carefully. So he asks, why then have you broken it down? Why have you left it open to the ravages of the wild? And so based on God's past care for the vine, the psalmist cries to God to do it again. Surely God will not fail to complete the work that he himself began. But notice in this 3rd section how the vine in verse 15 becomes a son. And then there's a reference to a son of man in verse 17. A description which I don't believe is ever used of the nation of Israel as a whole. And Asaph seems to have in mind here, first the nation of Israel, sometimes spoken of in the Old Testament as God's son, and then the king of Israel, David, who is also spoken of as God's son. For example, in 2 Samuel 7:14. And both the vine, that is Israel, and the king need God's help and presence. Now, as New Testament believers, we cannot read these verses without thinking of Jesus, who frequently spoke of himself as the Son of Man, and who is the one who is the appointed King, the Son of God himself. Let me suggest just two closing points of application, among many I could mention. First of all, as we come to God in prayer and bring to him the cries of our hearts, let us consciously remember that he is indeed Elohim Sabaoth, the God of all the hosts of heaven, the one enthroned on the cherubim, our great shepherd. And secondly, having faith in this great God does not exclude the honest and open lamenting of our deepest troubles. Indeed, faith gives us the boldness and the confidence to bring our deepest sorrows and pains to our Heavenly Father. He knows them anyway, even before we have formed them into words. The Lord bless you, and I look forward to helping you work through Psalm 81 in our next study.